What's up, everybody? So today I'm going to be doing a pickup install tutorial as well as tone demos for the Fishman Fluence Classics that are now in my Gibson Les Paul Studio. Stay tuned. So I got this Les Paul about a month ago, and I really dig it. It came with the 498T and 490R pickups. The 498T is probably one of my favorite passive pickups. It's got a really chunky classic sound, but I'm a Fishman guy at heart, and I really wanted something with more versatility. Now, when I got this guitar, I think you'll remember I did a video about Gibson, which you can check out here. And and I even demoed some of the tones from the 498T. So you can either go check out that video, or here's a quick refresher on what that pickup sounded like. So yeah, pretty beefy on high gain. I didn't have any qualms with it, but like I said, I wanted a little more versatility. I had already had a set of the Fishman Open Core Classic pickups in my Charvel SoCal 2 when I first bought it. Even with that one, it being, a matte black guitar, reverse headstock, I kind of wanted to metal it out, and that's why I installed the Ryan Fluff Bruce pickup in the bridge. I even demoed that pickup in this video here. Now, if you don't want to sit through the entire install tutorial, you can go ahead and skip straight to the tone demos. All in all, this video is going to be pretty lengthy, so if you want to watch the whole thing, great. If not, cool. The install tutorial is more geared towards people who have either never installed pickups or maybe have done it one or two times. And really, I wanted to do it to kind of break down the stigma behind, installing active pickups, because the Fishmans and the EMGs are a little bit different in how they're active. But ultimately, when you install them, you're installing the battery in almost the same way. So if you've never installed Fishmans or any active pickups, go ahead and watch it. You might get something out of it. Otherwise, the tone demo's at the end, and you can go straight to that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So our first step is to remove the strings. Pretty simple, loosen them up. I got locking tuners, so once they're loose, just unlock them, pull them off. Take note of your hardware as it comes off. You just don't want to scratch up your paint. The Tune-O-Matic bridge, you can make a note of where the posts are sitting, or, since I'm going to do a setup later, I don't really care. Next, we're going to go to the PCB, or printed circuit board, and we're going to remove all the components. This is pretty straightforward. It all just unclicks from the board. Next, we're going to remove our knobs. The best way to do this is to get a soft cloth and get it right underneath the knob. That way you can pull upward and you're not going to damage your paint with some sort of metal tool. Now we're going to remove the nuts that are holding on the potentiometers. Just get them loose enough to where you can unscrew them with your hand. Be careful if you're using metal tools. You don't want to scratch the paint. Once you have these off, it's a good opportunity to take a cloth and wipe down all the gunk that's been sitting under there for years. Now let's go ahead and flip the guitar back over and start working on taking out the PCB. Should just come right out. Now we have all the wires exposed and ready to deal with. Next, we're going to remove the output jack. Similar to the potentiometers, just take a tool, loosen up that nut. And once you get it loose enough to where you can use your hand, just loosen it up and pull it out. Don't forget to take out the washer. Now, let's work on removing the pickups from the guitar. Pretty straightforward. We have to unscrew the housings for the pickups. These mounting rings are just held in by 4 screws. Go ahead and take those off first. Once you have those fully removed, the pickups should just slide right out. Since we've already disconnected the PCB, you should be able to just pull out the lead wires. Set those aside. Now's a good opportunity again to go ahead and clean up the body of the guitar. There's probably been a lot of gunk under those pickup rings, and we just want to make sure that we have everything cleaned up. Next, we're going to go ahead and take the toggle switch wires and just remove the harness because we're going to use these wires. As you can see, we have 4 wires, 1 for the neck pickup, 1 for the bridge pickup, 1 for the ground, and 1 that'll run to the output jack. There's some additional exposed metal braiding here that is basically the shielding of the wire. That'll also run to ground. Next, let's open up the toggle switch cover and just identify which wires are going to which pickups. Once you've color matched where each wire is going, go ahead and make a note. That way, when you go to install, it'll be really easy and quick. So in this case, we have the green wire that'll eventually run over to the output jack. Now, as I suspected, this green wire is not long enough to make it completely to the output jack. Therefore, we're going to splice in an additional piece of wire to make up for the length. Go ahead and fit a piece of heat shrink over your wire, and then pre-tin the end of the exposed green wire. Do the same with the exposed end of the additional wire that you're going to add to the green wire. Go ahead and put down a cloth on your guitar since you're going to be working with solder and you don't want to get solder all over the back of your guitar. Now go ahead and twist together the 2 ends of the wire Make sure they're nice and secure. Once you have them together, go ahead and add a bead of solder just to make sure that that connection is protected. Now go ahead and put the heat shrink over that connection. Then apply some heat and then watch the heat shrink do its job. At this point, go ahead and pre-tan the end of the additional wire that's going to eventually be hooked up to the output jack. This will save you time later. Now let's go ahead and pull out all the wiring for the pickup installation and get it all identified and separated out. Once you have it all unraveled and know what everything is, go ahead and just set it aside for now. So next, we're going to focus on wiring up the tone pot push-pull with the capacitor that came with the pickups. Go ahead and use a pair of alligator clips or some sort of helping hands apparatus to help you hold up the components while you work on them. If you don't have one of these on hand, you can try to find something that'll prop up your piece just so you don't have to use your hands. Otherwise, you'll have to use your hands. So looking at the schematic that Fishman provides, you can see on the push-pull pot that the capacitor is meant to be wired to ground on the pot itself. And then the second tier lugs on the push-pull are meant to be wired to ground as well. Well, today I'm going to show you a really quick and easy way to kill two birds with one stone. Basically, we're going to wire from the third lug the capacitor through the second tier lugs on the push-pull and then ground to the pot itself on the other side. And I'll show you what that looks like. But first things first, we need to scuff up the side of the push-pull pot so we can have a really nice and clean ground connection for our solder. Roughing up the side allows the solder to sit a lot easier on the metal. A small bead of solder will do for the initial connection. Next, we need to run a bead of solder on the third lug of the sweep of the potentiometer. Make sure the hole is fully covered and that the solder is nice and shiny. Next, we'll take one end of the capacitor and run it through that second tier lug of the push-pull. Go ahead and bend that end of the capacitor over where it's touching that ground spot that you made with the solder. Next, we're going to solder that connection onto the side of the pot. Next, we're going to go ahead and trim off the other end of our capacitor so it will fit within our third lug. Get the end of that capacitor seated on the third lug so when you apply heat, it can go straight through the lug. Don't push it too far forward, or else you have to trim off more. If you need to reheat and reseat, go ahead. Just make sure that the connection is nice and solid and that the solder is nice and shiny. Additionally, to protect this connection, add another small dab of solder to the connection. Lastly, add a small bit of solder to each one of the lugs on the second tier of the push-pull to protect the connection of that capacitor as it runs through those lugs. If you accidentally add too much, just apply a little bit more heat and pull off some of that extra solder. So now you have a fully wired up capacitor on your push-pull tone pot. You're going to do the exact same thing with the other push-pull tone pot. So now that you have both tone pots wired up with their capacitors, it's time to work with the volume pots. So as you can see on the Fishman schematic, the volume pots and the tone pots need to be connected from the first pot of the volume pot to the second pot of the tone pot. Additionally, the volume pots have to be grounded to the tone pots as well. And lastly, the two volume pots will be grounded to each other. To do this, I'm going to pre-cut some lengths of wire to use as my connections. I'm going to cut 2 white wires to go between the volume pots and the tone pots, and 3 black wires to act as grounds between the volume pots, tone pots, and the 2 volume pots. Make sure they're long enough that they'll reach each other in the cavity, and if they're too long, you can always trim them down later. The first thing I want to do is I want to apply some solder to the first lug of the volume pot. Then apply some solder to the second lug of the tone pot. Next, let's go ahead and connect the first lug of the volume pot to the second lug of the tone pot. So before we move on, we have to ground the volume pot to itself. The third lug of the volume pot needs to be grounded to the casing of the potentiometer itself. In order to do this, we typically bend the third lug until it touches the potentiometer. However, on these really small mini pots, it can be kind of hard to get that lug to make good contact. So as long as you use a little bit of finesse and some patience, you can actually make this connection work. Try not to go too fast, and try not to use too much pressure because you don't want to break off the lug of the pot. So once you get good contact, you're ready to add a little bit of solder just to make that connection secure and make sure you got good conductivity between the 2 points. So with that out of the way, now we can move on to grounding the volume pot to the tone pot. This is going to be done by running the black wire from the top of the volume pot to the top of the tone pot. So once you scuffed up both points and add a little bit of solder, now you can add the wire. Go ahead and strip both ends of the black wire, or whatever color you're using, and pre-tin each end so it'll make it easier to make a good soldered connection. Now that you have them both ground to each other, it's time to move on to the other set of pots and do the exact same process. So now you have two sets of volume and tone pots soldered together. So now it's time to start working on installing the pickups themselves to the tone pots. You'll notice that you have a black and red connection and a white and red connection. Black goes to bridge, white goes to neck. But the two red wires will be running to the battery terminal's positive connection. And in order to make this connection happen, we're just going to take both red wires and solder them straight to the red wire from the battery terminal. Go ahead and load up some heat shrink on the wires ahead of time, and then twist together both connections and get ready to solder them together and use the heat shrink to protect them. Pretty straightforward and similar to what we did with that extra wire running to the output jack. Now the battery is ready to go, and we won't have to deal with it until later on. So now the real fun starts as we're going to wire the lead wires to the volume pots from our pickups. Go ahead and strip off the black covering to expose a white wire and some loose metal shielding material that'll go to the volume pot. The white wire is going to make contact with the first lug of the volume pot, whereas the exposed shielding will end up getting ground to the top of the volume potentiometer. Go ahead and do your scuffing and add a little bit of solder. Go ahead and solder the lead to the first lug of the potentiometer. Go ahead and protect the connection by adding another bead of solder. And once you have that done, solder the exposed shielding wire to the top of the tone pot. We're going to repeat the same process with the neck pickup. So go ahead and strip the cover to expose the white lead for the neck pickup, as well as that metal shielding material that you're going to run to ground on the potentiometer. Go ahead and strip and pre-tin your lead and solder it to the first lug of the volume pot. Add a little bit of solder to protect it. Now let's go ahead and solder our shielding material to the volume pot. As you can see, this process isn't without its hiccups. Sometimes you'll have to reseat, resolder, sometimes adjust things as you're going. But once you have good connections, all should be well. So now we have both volume pots wired up to our pickups. Next, because this pickup set comes with multiple voicings, we need to wire up the 2 different preamp voicings to the push-pull pods. As you can see from the Fishman diagram, the yellow and blue leads go to one push-pull pod, whereas the orange and green ones go to the other. Now on this diagram, they have wires running to individual lugs. However, you can simply solder both wires to a single lug and it'll work just fine, which is what I'm going to do here. Go ahead and get your wires twisted together, yellow to blue, green to orange. We're going to add a bead of solder to the lug on the first tier of the push-pull pods. Next, we're going to go ahead and seat in our twisted wires to the lugs on the push-pull pods. Add a little bit of extra if you need to. Once you have the green and orange soldered up, go ahead and solder up the blue and yellow. Or you can do it the other direction. It doesn't really matter the order. Now you have both voicings wired up on the push-pull pods. Now we're basically ready to go ahead and install these potentiometers into the guitar itself. But first, we have to wire up the output jack, so I'm going to set these potentiometers aside for now. The first thing to do is wire up the toggle switch wire, one that we added the extra wire to in the first place. And go ahead and match up the rest of the wires that we're going to be putting on each contact point on the output. Go ahead and fix your output switch to something to hold it in place while you do the soldering work. Looking at the Fishman diagram, we can see that the toggle wire runs to the tip of the output jack, while the ring of the output jack will run to the negative of the battery terminal, and the sleeve of the output jack will get ground to one of the potentiometers inside the cavity. So we'll add a bead of solder to our contact point. We'll go ahead and we'll solder in the output jack connection. We'll go ahead and we'll repeat and we'll solder in our ground that'll go in later. And lastly, we'll go ahead and solder in and connect our negative battery terminal. Once this is done and completed, go ahead and install the output jack to get it out of the way. Now with the output jack installed, we can start working on our toggle switch wires and get them set up for connecting to our potentiometers. First thing we need to do is expose more of the wires to get the proper length for actually fixing them to the potentiometers. To do this, go ahead and cut off some of that sleeve that's covering up some of those wires and get a good length of wire exposed so you can work with it. This extra bit of shielding wire can either be ground along with the black wire coming from the toggle, or it can be left alone and just cut off. These pickups don't require you actually use it, but I'm just gonna wire it up anyway, just to be consistent. So now we're ready to install our potentiometers. They should just easily slide in place into the holes that exist. One thing to note is that these pickup sets come with short potentiometers,
And you'll need long potentiometers if you're working with a carved top or some sort of Les Paul or Gibson style guitar. Fishman is more than happy to send you these for free if you just reach out and ask. So once the potentiometers are seated in the body of the guitar, go ahead and lightly hand tighten them to secure them. Then go ahead and feed the pickup wires into the pickup cavities and get the mess of wires out of your way to work with the potentiometer. Now that we have a clean working space, let's go ahead and start wiring up the toggle switch connections to the potentiometers. Go ahead and strip the wires to expose the metal braiding, and then go ahead and pre-tin the ends of the wires. Go ahead and add a bead of solder to the middle lug of the volume pot. And go ahead and install the white wire to the volume pot for the bridge pickup. Next, do the same for the neck pickup. In this case, I'm doing the red wire. Next, let's go ahead and ground the output jack to one of the volume pots in the cavity. Next, we'll ground the toggle switch to the top of the volume pot using the black wire and exposed shielding in tandem. Then we need to ground the two volume pots together. Now all of your pots are soldered together in their proper configuration. Not my prettiest work, but it'll work. Last thing to do is solder the bridge ground to one of the potentiometers. In this case, I'm going to use one of the tone pots. Gibson likes to use an exposed copper wire to ground to their bridges. This type of wire is tricky to get to hold on to a potentiometer, so you might have to finesse it a little bit. If you have to resolder and move things around, that's perfectly fine, just as long as you have good connection points and shiny solder. So now that we're all wired up, we're going to go ahead and test for continuity. On my multimeter here, what I'm looking for is a 0.00 reading across each connection that I make. If it reads 0, then I know I have continuity. Using your positive readout on any first lug of a potentiometer and then touching the negative to any other piece of metal should give you a continuity reading. You can even test the output jack to make sure that everything's running to the output. Now we're going to go ahead and uninstall the old pickups from the pickup rings and install the new pickups. This is pretty straightforward plug and play, so I'm not going to bore you with the whole sequence of doing it. Instead, let's do something a little bit more useful and see if our pickups actually work. A really easy thing to do before you string it up and get it all set up is to plug it in and listen to see if you can hear the pickups by using just a metal screwdriver. You tap on the pickups and you start to hear a signal coming through your amp. It means they're working. Go ahead and test both positions. In the middle position, you should hear sound out of both pickups. Then obviously in the bridge and neck positions, you should only hear signal from those pickups. You can even test the coil split function here, as you should get more of a pronounced signal from one side of the pickup than the other. And when you disengage the coil split, you should get a much hotter signal out of the pickup overall. But now that we've tested that and we know the pickups work, So here's the finished product. My wire management isn't the greatest, but it works for my purposes. So now let's move on to how to deal with the battery. One thing I like to do in this instance is take the battery, wrap it in foam, and tape it with some electrical tape. This just gives me a little bit of a buffer while the battery sits in the control cavity and doesn't interfere with any of the wires. So just go ahead and stuff it in there, and it should fit. Let's go ahead and put our cover back on correctly, and we can screw it all back into place. So there is our finished install.
So I got it restrung, fully set up. Let's go ahead and see how they sound.